outside of it, and it is being recorded as a public meeting. So if you need to turn your camera off, that is completely fine. If you need to eat or eat a salad or, whatever it is you're doing, so that's a-okay. We also want to make sure that we're optimizing for deciding and acting. It is a work group. And then just a reminder, if you haven't seen it with a little bit of the email discussion, we have to make certain that we don't deliberate outside of the meeting. So just be aware of that. And thank you for mentioning that, Mark, and then for Aaron following up. Sure appreciate that. Autumn, you have a question?
I do, related directly to that.
Yes.
It was my impression that you guys wanted us to provide feedback and homework from what we've done. I understand that discussion is a different thing, and it's kind of hard to stop someone from responding to what someone else puts out there. But like when I shared all of the job descriptions from my agency and from MPD, it was to share to everybody just as information that was then provided as a part of the record. So I guess I wanted to get some clarity about whether we can say, this is a thing, and not respond to something that someone else said, but just say, this is something that I've noticed, or this is something that I think moves the discussion forward, that I found of interest, whatever, as long as we're not discussing that back and forth. I know it's hard for someone to not want to respond when someone says something that enlivens a discussion, but I guess I wanted to clarify that, because that was the impression I got, was that we could put stuff out as long as we weren't responding to each other.
This is Erin Severe. Just to speak to that, I think a good way of doing that is, if you have content that you want to share with the whole group, to email it to Billy in advance of the meeting, and then he can circulate any of that content with the agenda and the research that OPDS has provided. That makes sure that it's kind of like it doesn't sort of create an email chain.
Yeah, if you want us to just send it to Billy, I am totally good with that, and that's good feedback.
Awesome. Thanks, Autumn. Great question. Thanks, Aaron. We're going to start out the round robin just real briefly. The round robin may be shorter today because we had a few more things added to the research, the relevant research. And so if there's any additional thoughts about that collected data, as well as vulnerabilities and risks, we had talked about that a little bit last week. So we'll take some time to go through that. If you don't need the 5 minutes or very little of it, that's fine too. Just then invite the next person. Our probably primary objective will be to work on the draft, a draft document or a draft definition for staff. I put something out there simply to based on comments about wanting to provide maximum flexibility for a definition. So, there's a maximum flexible definition. But what we'll need under Robert's Rules of Orders is a motion for a definition when we get ready to move into that part of the meeting. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're listening to the round robin and presenting yourself. And with that, I'd like to invite Mark Lang to start our round robin this morning. Mark, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
All right. Thank you, Mark.
So you want me to just talk about the definition that was out there, or?
You really, this part of it is really just to, you sure can, but it's really the focus is on any sort of additional research that was provided, and it is around the definition, but it could also be around the ratios as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I'm still thinking that we need to look at, I like the definition that was had been circulated. I also think, in terms of just my research and kind of working on it, is that I can't remember who mentioned it last time, but the issue with technology and adding that as a part of that definition of being able to use some type of IT support as part of the staff measurements. So I think that would be important for me in terms of going forward and adding that, because it's just looking at all these recent hacks that have happened with all these organizations, I just think we're going to need to be prepared for that issue. And, you know, we have a lot of vulnerable information with our clients that could be intercepted online. And so I just think we need to figure out a way to make sure that that's part of any definition going forward. So I apologize. I'm in my car going to the detention center, so I don't know who's on the call. So I would invite whoever wants to go next. So, sorry.
Feel free to jump in. Mark, you want me to invite somebody?
That would be great, Billy. Thank you.
Michelle Bartov, are you on the phone? Are you?
Yes, I'm here. I can go, and I had a similar question to Autumn when we began, because me sending out that definition was just kind of in advance of the meeting so that people could see it in writing. So one thing that we might do moving forward is, just thinking out loud, is if we could get like a deadline to send to you guys any ideas or feedback we have, and then that could go out in the next agenda, and then people could see it in writing as opposed to kind of throwing it out during these 5-minute round robins. I just wanted people to see my proposed definition. It's really similar to OPDS's, what you guys sent out. I just added a couple words basically. So my proposed definition would be: legal support staff performs clerical, administrative, communicative, and or delegated substantive legal work under their direction and supervision of an attorney. I just wanted it to include a couple more of those tasks and be a little more all-encompassing, so we could be, again, as flexible as possible. I did review the data that we got, that last page with the 3 charts on it. I think it's appropriate, and it makes sense that the non-urban has a higher staff to attorney ratio. I think that makes sense. That kind of goes back to what I said in the last round robin about page 6 of the previous material, saying that, you know, attorneys who are traveling more and more rural, they might have a higher need for staff just to be handling more things in the office. I was a bit confused about the first chart. It has the consortium, law firm, public defenders, and sole proprietors, so staff per entity type. And I was a little curious as to how people were put in those different boxes, because I consider myself, you know, a sole proprietorship, but I'm also part of a consortium. And I think that that would be a common, you know, thing for consortium members. We're solo practitioners, but we're also members of a consortium. So I was a little curious about how that breakdown occurred. And I thought it could be more helpful in considering ratios moving forward to really see each contractor's, that appendix 2 that we submitted, where it was, here's each contractor and here's their staff, so we could really see what it looks like on the ground. The charts were helpful, but not as helpful as, I'd like more information, basically, I think would be more helpful to determine those appropriate ratios. Right now, I think for, you know, in terms of me being out here in Eastern Oregon, I think a 1-to-1 for solos is appropriate. I think a 2-to-1 in firms for staff is appropriate. I really can't speak to public defender firms because that's not my forte. With regards to the staff supervisor ratio, I have some concerns about that in a consortium. You know, we have the need to maintain our independence as independent contractors. There's also the need for confidentiality, so we can take, you know, keep our conflicts separate. And so I guess there's some question in my mind of, you know, would supervisor have oversight and a caseload? And then does that mean that we would need to bring on another consortium attorney to make up for any difference in the caseload? Because if so, it's already pretty hard to get new blood, so to speak, out to Eastern Oregon. So filling that gap would be pretty difficult, especially if it's a small contract amount. So, you know, and part of the benefit of being in a consortium is that we kind of all are our own supervisors, for lack of a better way to say it. And so I think including a supervisor role, I'm just not sure how it's feasible in a consortium, and that's a big concern to me. So that was really my feedback, and I did send out that definition in writing just so people could review it in advance. I was just kind of thinking out loud, so I'm not like married to it or anything, but thanks for the opportunity to provide this round robin info, and I will call on Chris.
Michelle, Chris, before you start, I just want to confirm or just follow up with how we came up with sole proprietorship versus a consortium. So that was a contracted entity, right? So if we contracted with you as a sole proprietor, then you would fall underneath that sole proprietorship list. Just for clarification.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks. Oh, thanks, Chris.
I guess I'm assuming I'm the only Chris. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I get my thoughts are a few here, so I'll hopefully get them in order. And I apologize. I think I was the one that responded online, and I know better than that, and I did it. And then when Mark wrote in, I thought, no, that was me. So sorry about that. Won't do it again. One of the definitions was out of payout of contract funds. And I guess the concern I have there is I think a lot of, especially smaller firms, I mean, we've got a real wide variety of folks that are doing this stuff. And as these groups are, whether you're a PD's office or, large consortiums. But I think some of the smaller offices, smaller firms, I mean, I think there's a lot of folks that probably have spouses that work in their office that don't necessarily get paid. I think some offices probably have some of their college kids that work in their offices at times, different things like that. So I just think we want to be careful if we say out of contract funds, because those folks maybe don't necessarily get paid out of contract funds because maybe a spouse doesn't get paid by the husband or wife who's the attorney, yet they're in the office doing work. So that's one issue. And sometimes maybe there's volunteers in offices that do work, that sort of thing. Investigator, I think, is an issue we got to deal with. A lot of places don't have an investigator in-house. Most don't, I don't think. I know none of our consortium members do. We hire our investigators separately. So that is an issue. But I do think the definition, I mean, I think we've spent a lot of time on it. I think just a simple 1 or 2 sentence definition of a staff member is the best way to go, however we want to encompass that. But I think the simpler that definition is, because I think we really have a wide variety of folks that do different types of work in different types of settings. And I just don't think we want to make that overly complicated. I don't think we also, I mean, I think 0.5 staff per attorney is probably, I mean, I don't think we want to go higher than that. I mean, I realize there are groups that have more than that, but I think 0.5 per attorney is as high as we'd want to mandate people to have. I think there was a lot of folks that frankly didn't have staff, and probably there are some that still don't have a whole lot of staff, but 0.5 staff, I think half-time per attorney would be the maximum that we would want to go. One concern I have, and this may be completely out of line, but I'm going to say it anyway. Yesterday's meeting, I'm guessing a lot of you folks listened to yesterday's meeting. One of my big concerns was that right at the end that there was a discussion about us having to keep time, specific time, and provide that to OPDS. Which is going to take a tremendous amount of staffing and work to do that. That was the message that I got from Ed at the end of that meeting. We weren't really, it just kind of wrapped up right when that was thrown out and it was done. But the OPDS requirements, the new reporting requirements that we've had in the last several months, at least has caused us a lot more staff time. It's caused me more staff time to do those reporting requirements. I don't think OPDS is frankly been able to use the information we've been providing them, because now we're no longer having to report back, at least individual attorneys. So we're spending all that extra time. We got no extra money for it, yet I've got staff time being used and a lot more money being paid to staff to provide that information to OPDS. And I'm frankly wondering at this point why we're doing that if we're not using that information. And I think maybe, and my concern is, I mean, if we're providing in the future the amount of staff time we're going to need as attorneys to provide information of a daily timesheet to OPDS, exactly what time we're putting into cases, Not only are attorneys going to have a substantial amount of more time, but staff is probably going to be doing a lot of that work. And we're talking thousands of hours a day. I'm wondering whether OPDS can even process that. And if we're going to once again be asked to do something that is going to cost us a tremendous amount of time without being compensated. And frankly, OPDS will do nothing with that in the long run. Again, it's just something that I have a concern about. And I think that's going to be something that's going to have a lot of time involved in it in the future if that's in fact the road we are heading down. And it sounded after yesterday that is the road we're heading down. So that's all I have. And I would call on Autumn, unless Autumn's gone already. No, she hasn't. Okay.
Thank you, Chris.
Yep.
All right. So I think that Chris reminded me of a thing that I kind of wanted to ask about too. And I guess it's maybe a baseline question, which is whether when we're talking about this as the ratios of how many staff you have to have, whether that's a floor or whether that's a ceiling. And obviously that transitions straight into our next meeting, which is apparently going to be about the budgeting portion of how these happen. But of course, they're interrelated. I would not want to create a ratio and then talk about how to fund it afterwards, right? So I don't know whether you want to answer that.
Yeah, I sure can. Yeah, I would consider it a floor. That this would be the minimum for the ratio piece of it. It would be the minimum.
Right. Okay. So, basically, I think we're kind of leaning on the whole like PD office versus very small office. And I think this is very helpful to me to sort of understand how these smaller offices, and I can understand the structure of how those come up because I came from a very small town myself. So anyhow, in our office, we have, probably close to a 1-to-1 ratio if you count all the people that are not working directly with attorneys as like their immediate helper on their case. So like why we have definitions of administrative assistant or data processing people that generalize across the office and don't assist one particular attorney. And I think that also is another factor that comes into the ratios between supervisor and attorneys and how many they're supervising. As I'm looking through the materials, we talk a lot about supervisors' various roles and whether the supervisor then has a caseload or not, and how that would impact the ratio. So I think as I was reading through it, I was thinking about how if an attorney carries some level of a caseload, then can they supervise less people? Are we going to include that in the ratio? A 1-to-10 was suggested. The feedback I got within my office somewhat was 1-to-10 might be unreasonable if the supervisor has their own caseload at the same time. But additionally, that also goes into the money piece, because if we are saying that supervisors, if they're going to be managing that many people, they don't have a caseload, then how on an FTE model are we paying for those supervisors because they don't have a caseload? And that is the situation right now. My understanding, and I haven't looked at all the contracts, but my understanding is that consortias get a certain amount of payment for administering their contract, and that's a separate outside of the FTE. However, in PD offices right now, it's all based on FTE, and there isn't a separate chunk of money for administering the contract, and the administering the contract often falls to the supervisors. So just how those things interplay, I think, is part of where we might run into some hiccups when we're talking about ratios. Going back to the definition of staff and the limited definition, I think that keeping it as open and flexible as possible is great. I do think that we might need some flexibility in a PD office of who is supervising the trial assistant, or whatever we call them, trial assistants. So I'm using that term, but our attorneys don't supervise our trial assistants. The trial assistants are supervised by a trial assistant manager, and the trial assistant manager does that. So it's not like individual attorneys, like a brand new out of law school person is like, I'm telling you what to do, trial assistant who's been here for 20 years, right? Like we have a separate person that does that. And so just to make sure that the definition is flexible enough to account for the fact that obviously our executive director is an attorney, so if that counts as the ultimate supervisor, maybe, as long as it doesn't have to be directly supervised, because that's just not how we're set up. And I don't think that anybody feels like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it would seem weird that that would have to be how it's done, that it has to be direct supervision. But I just want to bring up that issue as well. I think that's what I've got for now. I'll kick it to Reed.
Thank you, Autumn.
So thanks. I'm new to this meeting. I'm here for Brooke, who is on vacation, enjoying himself, traveling his children all around the Western United States. I don't think I can say anything better than what Autumn just said. The concerns that I have when I was going through materials mirror hers almost directly. I think one of the other things I would like to add is that for large public defense offices, some of the administrative costs include, again, some of the administrative costs include having an office manager, having an HR manager that is going to manage the benefits for, 20, 30, 40 people, right? And that's a full-time job in and of itself, something that an individual contractor, a consortium attorney who's contracting with a consortium is not going to have to do. I mean, I don't think that they would require a full-time office staff to, take care of health insurance, take care of SEP, take care of IRA, things like that. So, these are additional costs that when we're talking simply about a contract model that sets, a staff, right, sets administrative staff. I mean, to me, it's difficult to contract with public defense offices in the same way and with the same definitions as a consortia, right? Because the consortia are using their administrative staff for separate things. The other thing, and I'm sure that you're going to talk about this at the next session in terms of budgeting, if an individual attorney who is contracted with a consortium that's contracted with OPDS is only expected to have 0.5 administrative staff to assist with them, that's going to significantly reduce their cost relative to a public defense office. If you have 2 attorneys and they have a full-time staff, I mean, that increases, and we have substantially more than that, we're going to be required to provide benefits. And so health, dental, payroll taxes, I mean, those are all costs that are going to be qualitatively different for public defense offices than they are for individual attorneys who are contracting through consortia with OPDS. Now, I've also been in jurisdictions in which there are main PD offices, there are consortium, and there's a small office with maybe 4 or 5 attorneys that handle a fairly significant portion of the overflow. I mean, they're going to have some of those additional costs as well. So, if we're thinking about those costs, I think for definitions, one, I think that's simple. We should keep it as broad as possible because the staff provide many different roles for any different attorney, and different attorneys are going to set their own roles for their staff. So I think we need to keep that definition as broad as possible, unless OPDS is going to set specific guidelines for what they're going to expect each attorney to expect then their staff to perform, right? So if we're going to set those, if OPDS is going to set those roles, then we can have a more narrow definition. But I don't see that as being feasible in the contracting model that we have. Money, people. We talk about supervisor ratios. Again, I agree with Michelle. I don't see how in a consortium it'd be feasible conflict-wise to have a supervising attorney for other attorneys. And in my experience being around consortia, they tend to have more experienced attorneys that tend not to require as much supervision as new attorneys that public defense offices have. So I guess I don't see that. That's an administrative cost that they might not have, they might not need. Public defense offices with newer attorneys, with many more new attorneys who are just out of law school, are going to need more super training and supervision costs. Right now, OPDS does not contract for management FTE, and they don't contract for supervision FTE. I think 10 to 1 might be a lot. If it might be 10 to 1 might be manageable if they aren't carrying a caseload. All of our managers carry caseloads and supervise attorneys. Basically, we're sort of at that ratio, right? We're almost at that ratio. And we're splitting one, we have 3 managers supervisors splitting 1 FTE, right? So, I mean, that's, if OPDS is going to contract for that, I think that'd be fantastic. So 10 to 1, with no caseload, great.
All right, thank you, Reed. You want to invite the next person to speak?
Is Jack Wilson on the phone? Is on the call? Jack Morris, I'm sorry, is Jack?
Yeah.
Can I call on him?
I'm here,
Yeah.
that's okay. I forget my own name sometimes.
Thank you, Reed.
So I originally was just gonna take a pass because I didn't feel like I had anything to offer this conversation, but I guess one of the good things about it, or maybe it's a bad thing, I don't know, it's we seem to be bringing up more questions than providing answers. And that's, at least that's the way it kind of strikes me. These discussions seem to have, and this isn't a criticism, but they just seem to be a lot more suited to big offices. You know, when we're talking about things like supervisors, I'm like, how does that, anything like that apply to me? And it's, you know, I'm reminded once again that the situation I'm in, I manage the primary contractor, which is my firm, and also the consortium, and both of those entities are big enough to be a pain, but at the same time they're small enough that we don't really have specialized roles in the office. Like we don't have a human resources manager and that kind of thing. So I'm kind of just blabbering here, but it just seems like a lot of this is really difficult to apply to some of the smaller contractors, and I've got 2 of them. So the other thing, I agree with a number of things that Chris said. You know, I know we're not, the subject of the discussion now isn't the timekeeping, but you know, I'll just tell you, I've got at least one attorney who's made it absolutely clear that he will leave if we're required to keep time. And he's the hardest working attorney, probably in the office. And I suspect that a couple others would probably eventually do it. And then the one final issue, and this is an issue I simply don't have an answer for. You know, encouraging a 1-to-1 staff ratio, I think, is a positive thing. I also think realistically requiring a half staff person is a positive thing. I think those are both moves in the right direction, but it also creates an issue. My firm has got, I didn't figure out the ratio, but it's like maybe 3/4 to 1 or something like that. The consortium attorneys, and I suspect this is probably true around the state, are going with the minimum. They've got a half-time staff person. And so, at least in the areas that I'm familiar with, the consortium attorneys who are perhaps a little bit less experienced are actually, their compensation is actually higher because they're opting to go with a half-time person, which I think fits them. But it just kind of results in a discrepancy. So I'll leave it at that.
Could you invite?
I have to put my glasses on to see who's here. How about Rebecca?
Okay, am I unmuted? Oh, good, I am. Hi, so like you, Jack, I was thinking that I might pass, but there have been some issues that I think I need to address. One of them is, so currently for me, we have, I think, 9 or 10 attorneys we're part of a consortium. It's a small consortium that does just juvenile work. And as the administrator of the consortia, I kind of have begun acting as kind of a quasi supervisor. And in my discussions with OPDS, that's what I'm doing. And as a result of that, I've reduced my caseload to half. I think that when you have, so that I have more time to be a manager. And fortunately for me, the people on my consortia have kind of accepted this has been gradually coming. Like, yes, we're all individuals and we all have our own practice. And in theory, Rebecca, you're not the boss of me, but I've been kind of telling them this is happening, like this is the direction that OPDS is going. They want, more accountability. And so they're fine with it. But with the small consortia like we have, I don't think it makes sense for a manager. So let me just say the worst managers I've ever had in my life are managers who don't do the work that I'm doing or haven't done the work that I'm doing. So I think that it makes sense for me, for example, and other people with a small consortia to have at least some cases so that you're in the trenches, so that when the people who are with you say, oh, this is going wrong, or this is a problem that needs to be addressed, you have a better feel for it. So I'm shying away from the idea of supervisors or managers not carrying a caseload at all, but certainly they should be compensated for having less of a caseload. So I think that's appropriate. I like the idea of 0.5 staff per attorney. I agree with, I think it was Chris who said we shouldn't go any higher than that. I also like Michelle's simple definition of staff that she sent out earlier. I agree with the comments that have been made that the simpler, the better. Regarding case managers and investigators, I know that some of the bigger firms and PCRP contracts have these as part of their contract, and certainly it makes sense that they would be staff. I have always felt that gives a disadvantage to the smaller contracts. And so I'm wondering if you can, so for example, in our consortia, we have a case manager that works with Clackamas County, but in order to get him on cases, on juvenile cases, we have to get an NRE for him. And so I'm wondering if that would count, because we get an NRE and OPDS pays for it. He's incredibly helpful. He's a fantastic case manager, and he works with all of the attorneys on various cases. He has a limit, of course, to how many cases he could take. But I'm wondering if we should consider that as counting for staff, since some of the bigger firms have on-site investigators and case managers. Could the smaller people say, well, I don't have an on-site person, but I get an NRE and that counts. I get an NRE for an investigator and that counts. And so I don't know if we should be considering that. And I think, just a quick comment on keeping time. There is a huge pushback on that. Every single lawyer in my teeny tiny consortia, like I said, there's like only about 9 of us, has complained about it, brought up issues about how it's going to impact their workload, how difficult it's going to be to manage it, all the complications involved in doing it. And so I'm just going to throw that out there. I don't know that we're going to resolve that today, but I definitely think it's something that should be on our radar. And I would call on, I'm finished, and I would call on Olcott.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you. I'm using the phone because who knows whether Teams will kick me off again.
First time, oh God, awesome. We made it.
I agree with most everything everybody said. Staff needs to be as broad as possible. I like Michelle's very simple definition. I played with it some, but that's a different issue. And to the extent that I started the brouhaha with sending out a definition and some comments, they were like Michelle, just, hey, I'm sending out stuff to start a discussion when we get in our meeting. Because, I think we needed a starting point. I don't think staff definitions should be tied to contract funds. Part of the reason to include investigators is and one of the questions I have about the charts is, what is the definition of staff? I know from talking to my analysts, and I understand it, can only include, at this point, staff that are being at least partially paid through contract funds, but that would include investigators in PD's offices, but it would not include investigators for consortia, even though they do the same function. And I think that's an issue that we need to deal with, is particularly for the ratio stuff. And I like 0.5, maybe it should be a little higher, particularly if we include investigators and case managers and all those folks that help us represent our clients. Ultimately, simple method for defining staff that is as broad as possible. And I brought this up at the last meeting, and I understand that my recollection is Massachusetts has virtually all individual practitioners as their defense providers, and they have independent supervisors who sort of supervise them. And again, particularly with consortia, I mean, it's certainly, you can have folks that in a PD's office or even in Jack's office that can be a supervisor and have a caseload. But realistically, in a consortia, you cannot do that because of the conflict issue. And ultimately, unlike a PD's office, you can't switch around. Well, you're a supervisor for 3 months, and then you're going back and doing cases because you can't switch cases between attorneys that way. So that's the issue with supervisors for consortia. It absolutely makes sense to me to have people that are making sure things are going like they're supposed to be going and getting paid for it. But those are my comments. Is Todd McCann here?
He is. Thank you, Todd. I wanted to just briefly mention the chart does not include investigation for PDs, so those are carved out from that the staff ratios there on that chart with the relevant research. So just FYI.
Thank you. It makes the numbers better, if you will.
Yep.
More comparable.
Yep. Todd?
Thank you. I've been able to watch the meeting from May 26th, so I was able to review what occurred at that meeting online, so that was very helpful. So I was able to take a look at that, and then the meeting agenda that was set out for today with the summaries on it was also very good. So thank you for putting all that together. Concerning the staff definition, saw the one on today's agenda, and then also saw the one that Michelle put together. I think Michelle's, just by doing the slight tweaks to it, covers it fairly well and keeps it fairly broad, which I think that we appreciate. One of the things about all this materials that we've been getting is I think that it's excellent in case we ever want to put some trainings together, just concerning all the various different entities and the different ways people look at the different jobs. So that has been good to see all the various types of entities and the information that comes in and how they work differently. One of the things concerning the staffing ratios, we have basically practiced the 1-to-1 concerning your FTE. So if we've had a person that's a 0.5 FTE, they need a 0.5 staff, they're full-time, they need a full-time staff. And it's one of the things that with the juvenile law practice, the way it's done in Marion County, is that we just end up being in court so much that we need the staff there to interface with both the agency and the courts to keep everything moving. So it's one of the things that it would be very difficult to have less than a full-time staff to keep everything working. So that's just the nature of the way the practice is right now. Concerning the other side of it, the supervisory side, we have 18 attorneys, and it's one of the things that is pretty much our administrator. It's that combination of case management, reports for OPDS, some of the HR part and stuff like that, that it's, I would say it's a full-time position of itself. It's not funded that way, but it takes up that much time. So hopefully that's some more food for thought. Thank you.
Person?
Mark Lang?
He's already spoken. Bruce, John Hamilton, John Sarr. Looks like the three that have not spoken yet.
Okay, we'll go with John Sarr.
Okay, first of all, I want to apologize. I was a little bit late today. I had to take a kid to the dentist, so I'm just joined fairly recently, so I don't want to go through cover a bunch of ground that's already been covered. It sounds like so far from what I've heard was everyone's pretty much in agreement that the definition of staff should be as wide as possible and as flexible as possible. And that really makes sense if what we're trying to do is figure out how much all of this is going to cost so we can deliver what we need to deliver for our clients and get also have the most flexibility, because there is a big difference in practicing in rural Oregon versus urban areas. And I know people have talked about that as well. And the investigate, I've been thinking though about the investigation piece that's come up. And so it really should be, it's a kind of a weird one, because investigators should be staff or counted as staff, or somehow we need to count that, because I know there's a difference if you're working for a PD who usually has in-house investigators versus the consortia or sole practitioners where we're doing NREs to hire investigators or other mitigation and people who do things like that. I mean, that also is part of staff, but we got to figure out how. I guess the question is, how do you account for that between the two, between the PD model and the consortium model? So I'm not sure how we can get that done, I suppose. Or at least some should probably try to figure it out. How much does OPDS pay outside investigators, and what's the kind of breakdown, and how does that compare to the a PD's office? As far as supervising, I know that's been talked about a little bit too, and I agree with a couple of things that other people have said. It is hard to have a supervisor in a consortium model versus working at one of the not-for-profit public defenders offices. Because I mean, I've kind of found that out this year, is I'm sort of the head of an organization where nobody's required to listen to anything I say, or I can't make the consortium members do something or not do something other than what we deal with on the day-to-day basis, which is everybody has too much work. So it's interesting, because I'm again, I feel like I'm the head of an organization, but I don't have any ability to make anybody do anything they don't want to do, because everybody is a private entity, and they're separate businesses, the various firms in Portland Defense Consortium. But at the same time, you do need somebody, and everybody knows that, who has worked in a consortia. Is everybody, you need somebody to do the numbers. You need somebody to deal with Salem. You need somebody to deal with the courts, which comes up from time to time when there's there sometimes are problems. So you do need somebody in that role, and I like it kind of, at least the way we're doing it so far, is I have a caseload. It's a reduced caseload. That it's not really that reduced right now. But it does help a lot, and I've always felt it's helped a lot to have somebody who's doing the job right along the folks in the line. Because at least, when you're talking to somebody, and I found this, this is something else. When I worked at MDI, I was supposed to have a reduced caseload, but it never was reduced, because people would leave and I had to take up their cases, and that just seemed to constantly happen. But, on the other side, I know what the lawyers go through. And and I'm down there every day and in court every day. So, those are my thoughts on that. And I think I guess John Hamilton hasn't spoken, so.
Yeah, thank you, John. I just wanted to real quickly reiterate, So investigation, there is a statutory definition for investigation. So that really would be our starting point if we were going to try to define something outside of the statute for an investigator. It really only probably applies at this point to PDs and probably a few law firms where there are employee investigators. So for the staff definition, we would definitely carve those out. And then caseworkers, case managers we have underneath, at least for PCRP, under separate contracts, and have a definition in there for in that contract for them as well. So we probably, at least for the purposes of today, we would be looking at no investigators or social workers being included in that definition of staff. John Hamilton.
I haven't heard anything that I disagree with. I really feel everybody said things quite well. I like the idea of a floor and a simple definition for staff. The problem with that, as far as equity and payment, is I won't operate an office without Westlaw, and we're operating at a 1-to-1 staff ratio, which is appropriate for our consortium model and appropriate for what our office does for the community. And so it really creates a situation where the floor disadvantages financially the attorneys that are, not as efficient, I guess, as at running their resource. And so Westlaw, we have a case manager that comes out of our funds. It's not an NRE funded position, but those ultimately, that burden for ethical work in my office and in our consortium falls on our attorneys. And so they ultimately have the flexibility to determine how best to meet their ethical and legal obligations to a client. And so keeping it flexible and keeping it a floor, I don't see any other way for OPDS to set those standards. So that's all I have.
And your only option for invitation is Bruce Tarbox.
Well, here I am. Can you guys hear me okay?
We sure can. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, John.
So I do appreciate simplifying the staff description to just the one sentence and the broad explanation. My sense of things is that 0.5 to 1 attorney is sort of workable for everyone. And probably with the bigger agencies, they get some economy of scale. With the smaller ones, as out here, we often share staff, but we often have to pay a little more for that. I know for our consortium, we're 29 attorneys with 20 staff currently. Some of those are spread out between attorneys. I do want to address the hourly. I think, it'll be an unpopular opinion, I think tracking time is the way to go. And the reason is, then we know exactly how much time we're spending on particular tasks, and we can relate that to the market. And I think historically, we've been underpaid for our work. That's clear, and we're often overworked. I'm sure everybody on this meeting has spent a 60 or 70-hour week fairly recently, and you're not often compensated for that. Every place I've worked has had some level of timekeeping, and generally that's for the private practice. And the reason is the client knows what they're getting and why they're spending the money they're spending. I don't think the legislature is going to understand what we do until we break it down into hours. I understand that on the federal level, that was the case. And in roughly the early 90s, they started tracking time. So I believe federal defenders track time. I know that my wife and other folks who work in the federal system track their time, and they're paid accordingly. For those of you who participated in the timekeeping study, I think it was last year, or it might have been the year before, it's all a blur. it was not a popular thing around my office for sure. But I think it became clear to a lot of people how they were spending their time, and they became more efficient and realized just how much they were working. And then realized, oh, this case rate model is stupid. And the change, of course, is that we're getting paid for the workload. So as difficult as it sounds, I would advocate for timekeeping. And ultimately, if you're paying attorneys by the hour or budgeting that way, well, you can budget staff that way. I mean, I think typically staff falls within the attorney hourly rate, unless you're talking about investigators or paralegals or something of that nature. So for administration, CIDC is a paid administrative budget. I think we're probably different than others. That encompasses specialty court supervision, arraignments, all the paperwork that goes with looking after anywhere from 25 to 30 attorneys at a time. And it's a significant amount of my time. You know, I am not really designed to carry a caseload, but I still carry about 40 cases at a time. Most of those are the difficult clients that have conflicted off other attorneys. So, I mean, the ability to get paid for this administration has helped to improve our consortium. That also encompasses a bunch of things that, maybe not all administrators would have to do, but that encompasses my work with LPSCC, my work with a bunch of local committees, just dealing with the courts on a regular basis, dealing with OPDS, of course, with Clackamas County Sheriff's Office, and the public, and doing the arraignments as well. I don't think we could continue in this way without having that funding for admin.
Bruce, you're right at the 5 minutes there. If
That's all.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. So I want to move into actual definition for staff and sort of using the Robert's Rules of Order to just sort of manage that process. I heard from several people that Michelle's definition that she had sent in an email, that may be the basis for an initial motion if somebody wanted to make it, but it's now open to sort of move into a motion for that. Olcott, I see your hand up.
I would move that we, and this is slightly changed from Michelle's, adopt the definition of staff as legal support staff provide support for attorneys through clerical, administrative, communicative, or delegated work under the direction and supervision of an attorney.
Okay. There's a second to that motion?
I'll second.
All right. So any discussion? Autumn, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that, I think that definition would be fine for a PD office. I just want to make sure that the flexibility is still allowed for the immediate supervisor to not necessarily be an attorney. So long as we're defining supervisor broadly, that, we have an executive director. Just as far as, I don't know, creating legislative history as to how we came to this definition and what we intended it to stand for.
Gotcha. Who else? Direction also may include, just FYI. I could see that being broadly covered under direction as opposed to supervision. Sorry. Who's next? Mark?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that definition, but I'd ask to add data support for the attorney as well. Since it talked about time, I think that's going to be important to include that aspect, and having doing that now currently with the PCRP program. That is an important part of staff work.
So you would want to include data support in that list?
Yes.
Olcott, you were the one that had the motion. Is there any comment about that?
Couple things. One, I don't have any problem adding a data support in there. I think it's covered by administrative. And on Autumn's comment, I specifically did not say direct super attorney because I think we want to include indirect supervision, as long as there's an attorney involved somewhere.
Would it be, Olcott, would you be able to, Elena, are you online? Will we be able to include that in some way, either in the chat or through an email so everybody could see that? We still have 20 minutes left, so I want to make sure that we have at least some opportunity for people to see the full definition.
Chat was turned off, otherwise I would have written it in.
No, we purposely turned it off because it's just too tempting. and then it makes deliberation, following the deliberation, really difficult. So if we just use it for the purpose of showing the definition, I think that would be helpful. Olcott, do you want to type that in there?
If I can, it still says it's turned off.
This is Alina. So sorry, I do have a provider here at the courthouse that I was assisting. So I'm not able to return on the chat since we've began the Teams meeting. So I'm happy to send out, I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that, what needs to be sent to everybody. I'm happy to send that definition by email, but that would be the only avenue that I could offer right now.
Gotcha. Aaron, thank you, Elena. Aaron, you had something?
Since I'm at my desk, I could just bring up a Word document and share my screen, and you guys don't need to see my face. So give me a second to do that, and then Olcott, I'll just ask you to repeat the definition once I'm set up. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaron. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron.
Billy, can you hear me?
Yes. Who is this?
Oh, this is Chris. Kind of. My computer died. I don't know. So I missed everything right when Bruce was finishing up, and I apologize for that. But I did have a quick question, if I could ask one. Is that all right? Or I don't know where we're at now. So I've been gone for 5 minutes.
Yeah, we're waiting for Erin. She's going to share a Word document with us with the definition that's been proposed. But you had a quick question in the meantime. That's fine.
Kind of a little bit of a comment on Bruce's and then a quick question. And I don't necessarily disagree with Bruce that hourly is always a bad way to go. But that's going to take a tremendous amount of our time and effort to do that. And I can't think of anything that's going to affect me in the next 6 months to 12 months if OPDS requires us to do that regarding not only attorney time, but staffing time. So I guess I'm wondering, because this was just brought up a few days yesterday at the end of a meeting, kind of bluntly, Billy, where are we going with this? I'm guessing you must have some sort of idea of hourly. We got to submit these hourly timekeeping things, whether daily, weekly, or whatever we got to do. When is this happening? Where are we going with it?
We don't have any answer for you today. So we have a brand new interim director. I am certain there will be continued conversation and discussion about this, not only on the Tuesday morning meetings with individual providers, but also with the commission. So I would just say continue to stay tuned, continue to stay plugged in, and make certain that you're a part of those conversations whenever they happen in a public forum. So we'll need to now shift over to, go ahead, Olcott, if you want to read your definition. I think Aaron is waiting. Thank you, Aaron.
Can you guys see my screen?
We can, thank you.
See your screen, and we'll start with what you already wrote, and then staff provide support for attorneys through clerical, administrative, data I don't remember what word you wanted there, Mark. Communicative and or delegated work under the direction and supervision of an attorney.
I just said data support. So.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Any further discussion? All right, then we can vote on it. Do we?
I have a comment.
Yes, Autumn, please.
I'm just trying to read through this and just sort of think about it grammatically. I don't necessarily disagree with the intention behind it. But legal support staff provide support for attorneys through clerical, administrative, data support, communicative, or delegative work. Just, I guess it's just clunky. And not all of the words are, I don't know. I don't know the grammar terms.
They're not parallel. They're in different forms. But
yeah. Parallel, that would be the one. So I guess I'm not coming up with a solution necessarily. It looks like maybe Aaron's kicking some things around in there though.
Do people think that administrative encompasses data support? Delegated, and it would be
delegated work. Yeah. This is Mark. I think if we want to make sure that we're going to get funding for, I'm just telling you, if you're keeping time, you want to make sure that that's very clear that we're going to need that support.
Okay.
Can we?
In my opinion.
What do we mean by data support? I'm sorry. I was pretty technical.
Well, what I'm saying is that part of the PCRP project is that we have to keep time. We have to put in what the case outcomes are on certain cases. And court events that happen, we have to put output on that. That mechanism involves creating a database and using a case management system that will let you do that. I see that as a higher function than just mailing a letter. So I'm gonna say I agree with Bruce, in terms of the time, it's gonna happen. I don't see any way around it, and I think that's what we're gonna need to make sure that we're compensated to make sure that we can produce those reports that Salem's gonna need.
Would it be better to have something either specific to timekeeping and or understand that it's included under administration and clerical work in an office where it's required?
Well, I guess my hope is that OPDS would support funding for increased data support or computer technology support.
Gotcha. So
I think it just needs to be.
Yeah.
There's a method to my madness.
Yeah, I heard both timekeeping and I heard IT in being included with data support.
Which is a bit broader than reporting.
I think maybe we should add the technical support area.
Technical support works for me.
Yep.
Oh, but not taking out data support. I mean, so there's another. Yeah.
Sounds good.
So this is Jack. I guess I'm curious if we were to adopt this definition, or really for that matter, any definition, what the end result is. I mean, it seems to be pretty inclusive. So I think it'd be difficult to list everybody it includes. Who, for instance, does it exclude that some people might think is controversial or disagree with?
I'm making an assumption that it would exclude investigators and a social worker / case manager.
So if I have, just to be devil's advocate, I guess, so if I have someone in my staff who is, you know, doing home visits on juvenile cases and that kind of stuff, and doing what I see as basically social work, they would be excluded? Or let, you know, let's say that that's half of their time or a quarter of their time. Would that portion of their time be excluded from the definition?
It would be. So I would say that you would do a non-routine expense request for that the same way you would if you had someone doing half-time investigation, but they weren't being compensated under the contract as an employee.
And I will just add that I think we don't necessarily have that as much at MDI, but I know that MPD uses their direct trial assistant staff people to go and meet with clients in jail, work on communicating with their family members, you know, looking at treatment needs, things like that, which I think, I mean, what a lot of us attorneys do is frankly social work, really, but I think some of that is handed off as well. So I just, to the extent we want to include that, I do think that that's something that a lot of staff could do, that you don't need an investigator or a social work or a caseworker label on that in order to include it. Also, I was just going to say
that would be delegated work.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm just trying to figure out where the line is that was just brought up by Jack's comment.
Yeah. Rebecca, you had a comment too. Thank you, Autumn.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jack.
What about the issue that was raised last time about answering services?
I think that would be included under here, but again, I think we would want to make certain that it was not like a primary support. In other words, your 0.5 is a answering service.
To me, this is Scott Thompson. That's communicative, and I specifically, and I think Michelle may have probably as well, did not define staff as employees. I mean, legal support staff is not defined as only employees. I think to me, communicative covers an answering service. That is a contracted service.
Whether support staff should be limited to employees is probably a big issue. It's probably one we need to talk about. I mean, I think maybe I'm the only one, but I'm guessing that perhaps some of us were taking for granted the idea that it would be an employee.
To me, ultimately, the only thing I can really think of that you can successfully delegate as a non-employee function is sort of an answering service. Almost everything else, the people are not going to be independent contractors under state law because there's too much direction.
So I disagree with that. I know that when the new requirement came out, at least it was new for us, that we had to have, you know, a certain amount of staff for every attorney as part of our new contract, that there are attorneys that would share a staff worker who works for other, like, I think there's some people who work for maybe even CIDC attorneys part-time and maybe a JACA lawyer part-time or family law part-time, and they bill by the hour for what they're doing, and they're committed to working at least half time for the JACA attorney, but they're not an employee of the JACA attorney. And so I think that there may be lawyers that are doing that. I think there are lawyers right now in Clackamas County that are sharing staff. And so I would hate to take that option away from people.
Yeah, I think most pay the legal assistants as independent contractors. There are a few of us who have employees, but most are independent contractors.
John Hamilton, you had your hand up?
I was just going to say, for efficiency, my IT guy and some of our data collection is done by an independent contractor. And they are providing direct services in support of the consortium's contract. So I like not having employee as a specific definition in here. Thanks.
Would the, Aaron raised the question, would an answering service be under the direction and supervision of an attorney?
This is Kyle. I think so, because I'm hiring the person, whoever the person is, I'm telling them this is what, in general, I want you to do. You answer the phone between these hours. This is how you answer it. This is how you get me messages, all that sort of stuff.
I would agree with that. I think, I would consider my remote receptionist someone that's under my supervision. Even if they're not directly in my office or considered an employee, I would consider them to fit under the staff definition. And I think my one nitpicky suggestion is that instead of having technical, data, communicative, or delegated work, I think the /or was important. Maybe I'm alone there, but I think it's just keeps it as broad as possible. So that's just my 2 cents on the wording there.
I just have a question because I don't understand. I've never used an answering service. How many clients does an answering service have? Is it like, is it like 2 clients, or like, is it like 10 clients, or I guess I just don't know how those work, just for analyzing it.
Several.
Lots.
Several
It can
clients.
depend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Depends how successful the answering
basically
service is.
Yeah, so like a service like Ruby, it just comes in through a it gets identified as your call, and then they know that that's your call that's coming in. But they work with several different people. So.
What if we had an entity that had a non-attorney administrator that has, I think we have one right now in the state, and we've certainly had a few of those in the past.
Good question, Billy. Given the time, maybe we should just sort of, if you will, table this and everybody cogitate on it with all these appropriate questions until our next meeting.
That was exactly what I was going to suggest, Scott. Thank you. We got 3 minutes left, actually 2 now. And this definitely, I think, would benefit from, just a little bit of ruminating and soaking in, letting it soak in a little bit. So, I think that's a great idea. So I will put this out as part of the next agenda. I feel like we're still on track with the timeline. I don't know that we need to talk any more about that. The next steps, the next round robin, I think we'll just open it up. Instead of doing a round robin, I think we just open it up and continue on the definition of staff. And any sort of thoughts about that, continue the discussion at that point. And then at the point that we can vote on it and complete it, then we can move into the ratio next. And I'll put out sort of what I was hearing for a consensus around that. And there were some questions that were raised. I'll try to provide some direction there. What I typically do, internally our deadline for getting materials to us is usually the Friday before the Wednesday meeting is sort of our drop dead date to get everything out to y'all. So, so we'll just continue that, and I will, there were several things. I heard a breakdown by contractor. I also heard, let's see, thinking about sole proprietor versus a law firm for consortium law firm versus a PD for supervision ratio. And then investigation breakdown between a PD and or a law firm with an employee and or through the non-routine expense. So to have some breakdown of that, like what that ratio is. I'm not sure how easy it will be to provide that for the NRE side of it for a ratio per attorney, probably the best to do. But we'll look into that, and I'll provide as much as I can for by that Friday before the next meeting. There we go. It's
Billy?
1 o'clock. Yes.
Billy?
There was a request for the information on the addendum 2 that was provided as a part of the RFP that set out. Does OPDS have that data that we can look at for what contractors already reported to the agency?
Yeah, so that was provided in the previous, well, part of it was in this, was in the
Okay,
chart that showed the attorney FTE by entity type.
Okay, that's where that data came from. Okay, that helps.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, that all came from y'all. Yep.
Billy, is
Billy
it
says-
possible just to zip out the definition that was on the screen right away, so we
Will
have
do,
longer
yes.
to look at it and think about it?
Yeah, I will do that right after the meeting. I'll send that out. Thank you. Reed, you had a question?
I was just gonna, since we're following the rules, second Cops motion to table the discussion on the definition.
Thank you, Reed. Wow. Our Robert's Rules of Orders expert. It's always good to have one of those in the room. Thank you. All right, very good. Well, we will also table the discussion, and then, yeah, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. We'll see you in 2 weeks.